Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you improve your chess play. Today we're going to talk about a couple of pieces of knowledge. A couple of these things are well known, some are not so well known, some are generally understood, but I've given them a name to help them be remembered. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is a well-known concept called piece domination. Piece domination is where one piece can kind of take away the squares from another piece. So one of the easy examples is a bishop versus a knight. Let's say you're in this endgame and you're trying to promote the pawn on b7 and the king's on the wrong square and the knight's just going to hop around the board, and you're not going to be able to check away the king on b8 with a bishop on h1. How can you win the game? Well, what you do, the easiest way to do it is to play bishop to e4. So if we draw a line from where the bishop can move toward where the knight is, you'll notice that the knight on the side of the board only has 4 squares, g6, f5, f3, g2, and these 4 squares can all be covered by a bishop on e4. So what happens is Black is now in kind of a zugzwang position because the bishop is dominating the knight. If the king moves off of b8, you can play king c7 and then get a queen. But the problem is the knight has to commit suicide otherwise. The knight would come off the back rank, the bishop would take, and now Black's in zugzwang again, has to move the king, king to c7 wins. So anytime you have a knight on the side of the board, a piece like a bishop can dominate all those squares. Okay, what other kind of piece domination could we do? Well, we can dominate a knight on the corner in a variety of ways. Let's clear out the board here. Let's say Black has a knight in the corner and you don't want him to come out of the corner. Well, if we look at the 2 squares that the knight can come out of the corner on, how many pieces could we have that would dominate those squares? Well, basically every piece on the board can do it with a little help. For instance, a king could go from e4 to e3 and guard both squares. And then one of the reasons why a king has more fighting value than a bishop or a knight is it can do things on the next move, like play king to g2. After king to g2, he's not only attacking the knight, but he's also guarding the 2 squares the knight can go to. So the king on e4 can dominate the knight on h1, which of course should not have much reason to go there in the first place, but assuming he is, the king on e4 can dominate the knight on h1 by playing king f3. What else could do that? Well, obviously a rook can. We see rooks do this. We have a position like rook here, and the rook wants to keep the knight in the corner. Well, attacking the knight, rook h2 doesn't work because the knight just comes out to g3. But the rook can go to g2, and now the knight is trapped. The problem is the rook is a little more powerless than the king is here. The rook can't attack the knight and dominate it as well and stop it from coming out, but it can stop it from coming out by playing rook g2. Same thing with the bishop. Bishop up here on a5 can come back to e1, guard these 2 squares, and now the knight can't get out of the corner. Obviously, the queen can do everything the king could have done and more. So if we have a queen on a2, then we could go to g2, which would hit both squares the knight can come out, as well as the knight itself. We could even kind of do this with a pawn with a little help. If we have the knight going in the corner, and we have a pawn on f2, if we guard that pawn with something like the king, then the knight's trapped in the corner. We do see a lot of piece trappings, with other ways that are not domination. For instance, suppose someone brings up a knight. Whoops. Let's put a knight on g4. Suppose someone puts a knight on g4, and you have a king like on d2. And you need to guard these 2 pawns. How can you do it? Well, you can just play f3, and if he plays knight takes h2, then king e2 guards the f1 square and traps the knight. For instance, let's say black's king is over here on a7 and he's watching two pawns over here. Then while black moves back and forth here, let's make it black's move. If black plays king b8, you can play king f2, continuing to guard the f1 square, king a7, king g1, hitting the knight and continuing to block the knight in. And then on the next move, king takes h2 if he could sack the knight for the pawn if he wants, and white wins. So when you have these kind of positions where your pawns are forked by the knight like that, very often you can trap the knight in. Let's put the knight back on g4 with a move like f3. Same kind of thing happens with bishops sometimes. Let's take the black king off the board here. If you ever look up the first game of the Fischer-Spassky match in 1972, Fischer thought that he could get away with taking the h-pawn with some clever lines with pushing his pawns. So he miscalculated and he played bishop takes h2, and white trapped him in. And of course on king bishop g1, white just plays king to e2. Now Fischer had some pawns on the board that made it a lot more complicated. Otherwise he never would have fallen for this beginner idea. But here the bishop is trapped and the king can come in and not only guard the square f2, but he can also attack the bishop and guard the squares as well. This is one of the reasons why kings have a fighting power of like 4 1/4 compared to bishops and knights being more like 3 1/4, 3 1/2. Okay, so these are examples of piece domination. All right, let's look at another idea of domination. Let's look at a concept that I call move domination. This is something that I have given a name to, and it's when you have a piece where you have multiple moves and one move does everything the other move does. So let's say you have a king on h1 in the endgame, and you need to get it into the action, maybe toward the middle or toward the queen side. And you want to go to either g1 or g2. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's no tactics on either square, that either square is equally safe. What should you do? Well, unless something very strange is going on, you could, if you have the candidate moves king g1 and king g2, you can pretty much eliminate king g1 because king g2 will go to all the same squares that king g1 can go to, with maybe the exception of g2, and more. So for instance, if you go king g1 on the next move, you have the choice of these 5 moves, which is kind of this lower rectangle here, this 2x3 rectangle. But if you go to king to g2, you can go to these 8 moves, which is a square, and that square contains this rectangle of the f1, f2, g1, g2, h1, h2 rectangle. So king to g2, which also can go to f3, g3, and h3, dominates king to g1, which can only go to the 6 squares in the corner, in the lower rectangle. So king g2 dominates king g1, and therefore you could pretty much eliminate king g1 as a candidate move. Now obviously if king g2 allows some sort of tactic like a knight fork or a skewer or something, that's a whole different story. But we're talking about just positions where you're just trying to activate the king, and you can look at the candidate moves and say this move dominates these other moves. So domination of moves is also an idea. And we see this with, again, a lot of the pieces. Let's look at an exchange variation of the French defense. Suppose we play e4, e6, d4, d5, e takes d. We'll play one of the old kind of boring lines, knight f3, bishop d3, bishop d6, castle, castle, c3, c6. We're just going to make symmetric moves. Bishop g5, bishop g4, knight bd2, knight bd7, queen c2, queen c7. All right, now we need to, let's say you know that you're going to put a rook on the e file, and you're not sure which rook you can put in. All right, well here we have kind of a move domination idea rather than a piece domination idea, which is, what's the only reasons why a rook would want to stay on f1? The answer is, if white's plan here is to play like knight e5 and then play f4, then keeping the rook on f1 is a really good idea because it's behind the f-pawn as it comes down the board, and the rook gains in power as you push the pawn. The other reason the rook might want to stay on f1 is if black is attacking this f2 pawn and simply guarding it with the king is not enough. Well, I think it's pretty clear here that black's not going to be able to attack that f2 pawn multiple times in the near future, so the rook doesn't need to stay on f1 to guard the pawn. And generally in these positions, pushing up the pawn to f4 is a less idea. It's a less known idea, so probably the rook doesn't want to do that. So if we're going to put both rooks on e1, it doesn't matter that much which one goes there first. But let's say you're only going to put one rook on e1 and the other rook's going to do something. Then what's starting to become clear if you're not going to play f4 is that rook fe1 is now starting to dominate rook ae1. Now there's several ways of measuring this. One way is by the domination method, which is if the rook on f1 is not doing anything, then rook ae1 leaves the rook on f1, which is doing absolutely nothing. And the rook f on e1 leaves the a rook with possibilities to push queenside pawns or to go behind his central pawn here. Or again, they could both double on the e file, which is the most likely thing. But putting the f rook on e1 dominates putting the a rook on e1 because it gives the rook on a1 a lot more scope than the rook on f1 does. Another way to do that is to just measure the number of moves both rooks have. If you play rook a e1, the rook on e1 has 7 going up the file and 4 going to the left. That's 11, but the f rook has 0. If we play the f rook to e1, he has the exact same 7 going up the file. He has the exact same 4 on the first rank, but the other rook, instead of having no moves, has 3 moves. So we're kind of dominating the other rook move 3-0 in terms of how many moves the rook that doesn't go to e1 is going to have. So if you're not sure which rook to move, sometimes you can use these domination ideas or maybe just count the mobility and figure out which one is the right one to move to the e file. And as I said earlier, if for some reason you're going to play knight e5, and right now you can't, the safety table tells us that black's got that square attack 3 times and it's only guarded once, so we're going to lose a pawn if we put the knight up there. And it's not easy to put the knight up there even in the future, because if we put the rook on e1 first, let's say rook a e1 with the idea of playing knight e5 and f4, and black does the same thing, he puts a rook on the e file, we still have not enough pieces to put the knight on e4, and this rook on f1 is now looking kind of silly. So it doesn't look like leaving that f rook on e1 is the right way to go. So we call this, again, this is kind of a piece domination. And there's just lots of ways you can look at move domination. Move domination, you compare moves and you say, this move does everything the other moves do and more. So let's say e4, e5, and you're trying to figure out, do I play knight h3, do I play knight f3, or do I play knight e2? Well, all of them develop the knight, and all of them might be helpful in some lines. But let's look at some of the issues involved. If you play knight to h3, and if the board was empty, we already saw a knight on the rim with the board empty has 1, 2, 3, 4 potential mobility squares. I call them potential mobility, not mobility, because the white knight can't actually move to all those squares. There's a pawn on f2. So potential mobility means how many moves the piece would have if the board were empty. And the knight on h2 has a potential h3 has a potential mobility of 4. The knight on e2 has a potential mobility of 6. There's our 6. Whoops. 5, 6. The knight on f3 has a potential mobility of 8. d4, e5, g5, h4, h2, and back to g1. So from a potential mobility standpoint, knight f3 is better than e2 or h3. How about if we do center control? Well, the knight on f3, if we count the center as just kind of this minimal center of e4, d4, e5, d5, the knight on f3 is attacking 2 of the squares. The knight on e2 is only attacking 1 of the squares. And the knight on h3 is attacking 0 of the 4 central squares. So again, f3 has the best score using that method. How about coordination with the other pieces? Well, in terms of blocking pieces, the knight on e2 blocks both the bishop's mobility and the queen's mobility. Well, blocking the queen's mobility is not a big deal, but blocking the bishop's mobility means that bishop will either have to fianchetto, or white will have to move the knight again and to get out of the way of the bishop. Knight to h3 doesn't get in the way of pretty much anything except the h2 pawn, which isn't going anywhere. So that's probably the best in terms of coordination. Knight f3 blocks the queen, but does not block the bishop. And blocking the queen, as we said, is not really such a big deal. So maybe knight h3 has the best of the coordinations. Knight e2 is the worst, and knight f3 may be in the middle. Well, if we look at potential mobility, center control, and coordination, knight f3 is first, and second. Knight e2 is second, and last. And knight h3 is last, and second. Or maybe last, and first, I should say. So it's pretty clear that knight f3, everything else being equal, which also has the benefit in this particular line of attacking the e-pawn, that's a bonus. Knight f3 kind of dominates knight e2 and knight h3, and therefore we can figure out that knight f3 is probably the best move of the three. Now you might say to me, well, I already knew that. You're not telling me anything I don't know. I play knight f3 here anyway. And my point is not that you didn't know that knight f3 was the white's best move for the knight here, but that you can apply the same kind of logic to your other moves when you're developing, when you're not in your book positions, to try to figure out which piece you want to move first. All right, I'm going to go into a different concept. If you read books, you'll hear about putting the question to a bishop. And I want to tell you about when you might want to do that. I have a concept called the two-way bishop. So let's say we're in a King's Indian. Knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, castle. And now, let's say white plays bishop to g5. Okay, one of the book moves here against bishop to g5 is to play h6. And this is called putting the question to the bishop. What you're doing when you do this is what I also call an AWL. AWL and putting the question to the bishop are two different concepts, but they overlap here. AWL means attack something with something worth less. And to put the question to the bishop means to attack it with a pawn and ask the bishop, what are you trying to do, Mr. Bishop? Let me know what you want to do, and that'll help me figure out what I want to do. Well, the bishop has three things that it can do here. It could put pressure on the knight, and if black moves the e-pawn, pin that knight to the queen. It could come back and play bishop h4 to keep the pressure instead of taking the knight, or he can come back to the center. If he plays bishop h4 and pushes and keeps the pressure, then clearly he's not taking the knight right now, and the bishop can't come back in the middle. It can only come back to g3, so it has less flexibility than it did before. If you play bishop e3, the bishop's back in the middle, but now when black pushes the e-pawn at some point, the knight won't be pinned, and he can move the knight freely. If white takes the knight, then black says, thank you for letting me know about that. I win the bishop pair, and I'm taking back with the bishop while my pawn is still not under attack otherwise. So putting the question to the bishop here is a really good idea. This AWL move puts the question to the bishop. Why would you want to put the question to the bishop, though? And the answer is, I call this kind of bishop a two-way bishop. Why two ways? Well, bishops, rooks can move in four different directions. The rooks can go up, they can go down, they can go left, they can go right. bishops go diagonally up to the left, down to the left, up to the right, and down to the right. So when two of these directions are doing things, in this case, two of the diagonals that he's going on, this bishop is strong on the c1 to h6 diagonal, and he's also strong on the h4 to d8 diagonal. Because he's strong on two diagonals, you can make him decide which kind of pressure he wants. By playing h6, you're saying to that bishop, which directions do you want to give me pressure on? For instance, if he plays bishop h4, he's pretty much limiting himself to the h4 to d8 diagonal. He's not really doing that much on the h4 to e1 diagonal. And notice now he only has two diagonals, two directions to go instead of four. If he plays bishop to e3, he still has pressure on h6, but that's pretty much the only diagonal. Now here, he's a pretty good bishop in the sense that even though he's a big pawn, he is guarding d4, and he is doing something there, but he's obviously, if he had played to g5 in the first place, he wanted to make it harder for black to play the typical center break moves with e5 because of the pin on the knight. And what you're doing is asking him, what are you going to do now? Now, a lot of people say to me, well, Dan, I don't like to move my pawn up to h6 because it weakens my king position. After all, you have me read Logical Chess Move by Irving Chernev, and he says, don't push those pawns unnecessarily in front of the king. It creates weaknesses. Well, pushing h6 does push the pawns a little bit in front of the king, but actually it gives the king another square that he can go to guard these pawns, and it doesn't really create any weak squares. In fact, right now the h6 square is a weak square. A weak square is one that can no longer be guarded by a pawn, and white can put his pieces on that square later if you don't do anything about it. Well, by playing h6 and moving the bishop away, and maybe later playing king h7, you're guarding that square a lot more than it could be guarded without the pawn on h6. So it actually doesn't weaken the black position much at all. Maybe not at all. Maybe it actually strengthens it. Depends on how you want to define the terms. But you want to do it now. Why not wait a move? Why not say, all right, I would like to recapture this knight with my knight if he takes it rather than the bishop, and I'd like to play c5 or e5. So why don't I play knight bd7 first, guard this pawn move, guard this pawn move, guard this knight? Wouldn't that be better? And the answer is no. If you wait a move, before you do that, a smart white player here is going to play queen to d2, and now he's going to cement the two-way bishop on g5 so that you can't knock it away. Now h6 is met by bishop takes h6, because the queen and the bishop are on the h6 square. And now that bishop is like the Rock of Gibraltar there. You can't get him off that square, and he's going to create pressure on both diagonals. This two-way bishop has become very, very strong on these two diagonals. Can white later play bishop h6 and try to trade off the fianchetto bishop? Yes, he can. That's not the major idea of playing queen d2, though. A lot of beginners, whenever they see a fianchetto bishop, they want to play bishop h6 and trade it off. That's not necessarily the idea here. The idea is to simply stop h6 so that bishop can do work in both diagonals for the remainder of the opening. And that's why playing a move like knight bd7 and delaying that for a move is not a great idea. You want to hit the bishop now. You want to hit it while you still can, while h6 is still a safe move. So when he has a two-way bishop, if he's not threatening to take that knight, and right now bishop takes f6 is not a threat, because black would be very happy if white gave up that strong bishop and gave up the bishop pair by playing bishop takes f6. So that h6 right now is a really good move. The only other book move besides h6 in this position is to play c5 right away and strike at the center. If we ask Stockfish what are the best moves here, Stockfish, what do you want to play here? It gives h6, right now h6 is number one. We'll bring it up and we'll show you. h6 is number one move here. c5 is the other move, and that's number two. And they're very close. I'm sure they can switch positions if Stockfish looks deeper. But those are the only two moves that keep white's advantage down near, a third of a pawn or so. If you play the third best move, now we're looking at advantage, which is over half a pawn. In fact, right now he's raised the white's advantage up almost all the way to half a pawn. Now it's back to a third of a pawn on h6. So you can see how important it is to play h6 here. A difference of being down a third of a pawn or being down 2/3 of a pawn in the opening is pretty massive difference. All right, let's stop the computer. We'll bring the board back to full size. So anytime you have a bishop that's really good on these two diagonals, especially on your side of the board, I call that a two-way bishop. And if you can attack a two-way bishop with a pawn, then that's a really good idea to make it maybe more of a one-way bishop. And one-way bishops are easier to deal with. You know what they can do. You know how they can harm you. You know how to play against them. Two-way bishops can do a lot more and are a lot more annoying. So as we see in a position like this, if you don't play h6 right away, white will play queen d2. And you could see how much Stockfish thought that white's advantage grew if you don't play a move like h6 pretty quickly. This is a really important idea to know. And when I teach a lot of intermediate amateurs or lower intermediate amateurs, they don't understand these ideas and they don't do them and they don't study their openings, so they don't realize that these are the book moves, and then they wonder, gee, Dan, I played the opening, I got out all my pieces, but then I didn't know what to do in the middle game, or I got into trouble and my opponent's pieces were all over me. Sometimes learning these little ideas on how to neutralize your opponent's advantages are really important. Okay, if you liked today's video, please give it a like. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit subscribe. I think we have over 2,000 subscribers now, so I appreciate all the subscribers. And we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.